So there's an anniversary today. I know you're thinking, who would get married on Yom Kippur? Well, there are other types of anniversaries. Certainly, we celebrate the anniversary today of the rites that took place at the ancient temple in Jerusalem. As we engage in our worship here, we recall their power and hope for their efficacy in our own day. But of course, there are anniversaries from more recent days as well. I think in particular of 40 years ago today, in the Yom Kippur War. It's hard to overstate how important that conflict was in Israel's understanding of itself and in its feeling of security. As surely as we as Americans felt the after effects of Vietnam and now of Iraq and Afghanistan, Israel still lives the reality of that war. Let's go back to those days of 1973 for a moment. Israel was still high on the victory of 1967, in 6 days smashing the enemies who had been involved in a low-level war of attrition since the founding of the state in 1948, the constant rockets, the shells that landed on civilians, and then the specter of growing terrorist attacks as well, which reached their lowest point at the Munich Olympics of 1972. That last war in 1967 was supposed to cow the enemy, leave them forever wary of engaging again. Of course, October of 1973 proved very different, and it showed just how misplaced Israel's confidence was. As General Ariel Sharon remarked earlier that year in the Israeli elections, within the present borders, we actually have no security problems. Some of the darkest days in Israel's 65 years were at the start of that war. It began with a tragic misreading of the intelligence, despite the fact that the son-in-law of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the former president of Egypt, was in fact a Mossad agent. They just didn't get it. Military intelligence and the Prime Minister Golda Meir simply misread the facts before them. They were certain Arab armies wouldn't dare to attack until they had the most advanced weapons that the Soviets could supply. And even then, they were sure that the fear of Israel's army would keep them at bay until they thought they had a tactical advantage over Israel. Despite the intelligence, despite the warnings which came even from King Hussein of Jordan 10 days earlier, there were minimal preparations. Israel's defense was based upon the readiness of its regular army, just as it is today, and also its ability to call up its reserves within 48 hours, just as it does today. Well, the morning of October 6th caught them in a bind. Intelligence was now recommending a preemptive strike because they saw the writing on the wall. They began a call-up of the reserves. But a message was also received in Jerusalem from our Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Don't preempt. Well, at 2 p.m. that day, Yom Kippur, Egyptian and Syrian forces started swarming across the then lines of ceasefire from the 1967 war, across the Golan and across the Suez. The Bar-Lev line that had been in place in the Suez, a line of forts and fortifications to hold off the enemy, was almost immediately overwhelmed. The tanks that were there weren't even in the proper place. The only thing that stopped the Egyptians from overrunning the entire Sinai Peninsula that day was their shock at their own success. There were no forces left in Sinai able to repel the Egyptians, and the Israeli Air Force no longer had supremacy. The Egyptians had new weapons in place, and they lost many aircraft even trying. While this was going on in the north, Syrian tanks, over 1,000 of them, assaulted the Golan and overwhelmed the Israeli defenses. The Israelis fought bravely and at tremendous losses that continued to the next day. Outnumbered 4-1 by the Syrian forces, brigades of Israel's defense forces were fighting to nearly the last man. Israel suffered close to 1,000 casualties in just the first 2 days, and hundreds were taken prisoner. Their loss of tanks and aircraft was so great that General Moshe Dayan, then the defense minister, said to the Prime Minister Golda Meir that their actions would determine whether or not the Third Temple fell. What he meant, of course, was whether Israel would survive. How bad was it? Overnight, from the second day to the third day, in Golda's kitchen cabinet, Israel was considering the doomsday scenario. The consensus of historians now is that Israel's nuclear missiles were armed and positioned that day, just in case. The unthinkable was already being thought. Thank God, by the end of that day, and by the beginning of October 9th, Israel's reserves had regrouped and begun the costly but successful counter-offensive. The main problem that Israel found in pursuing its counter-offensive was resupply. We think from the current vantage point, of course, and we say, how could Israel have a problem with supply? But America was not the major supplier of weapons to Israel in 1967. America didn't want to anger the Arab states and OPEC, much like the rest of the developed world. By supplying them weapons, that's exactly what would happen. Israel was feeling squeezed. And frankly, the political calculus at that time for the United States and for Europe was that the Arab states had more diplomatic and economic value than Israel did. The reasoning should sound somewhat familiar to us today. You hear very similar arguments. Well, as Israel's counteroffensive rolled on, they were critically short of arms. They were worried that they would exhaust their capabilities and leave nothing behind in case the unthinkable happened and their forces were broken and Syria and Egypt advanced into Israel. They had no hope of sales from Europe. Kissinger is said to have calculated that Israel needed to bleed a little bit before America stepped in order to satisfy the Arab states that the United States was being even-handed. Golda's only remaining plan was to fly secretly to Washington and attempt to plead with President Nixon for an hour. Kissinger vetoed that plan. The U.S. did come through, though, and began a big airlift. Part of the political calculus for us at that time, of course, was opposing Soviet interests. And since the Syrians and the Egyptians were Soviet clients, we had to step in order to balance the scales. By October 14th, military transport planes began arriving in Israel. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, even a few fighter jets. Once those supplies arrived, Israeli morale improved and its war effort came back. By 10 days later, October 24th, it was a decisive victory for Israel and a ceasefire was established. Negotiations continued until May of the next year in order to get Israel's prisoners back. The price of that victory was great. Israel suffered 10,000 casualties, including nearly 2,700 dead. 100 of its aircraft and 800 tanks were destroyed. And I remind you that when tanks are destroyed, there are people inside them burning to death. As Israel found, scores of its prisoners of war were tortured and executed by the Egyptians and Syrians. Burns applied, finger and toenails pulled out, hands tied behind their back and shot in the head. It made clear to every Israeli soldier what the cost of capture was. There are fates worse than death on the battlefield. This defeat, or near defeat, led to a lost decade in Israel. It took that long to rebuild its defenses and to rebuild its psyche, and the cost of rebuilding its military after those losses was tremendous. The failures of intelligence and the failures of political leadership that let Israel be exposed like this led directly to the change in government and the first Likud government that was elected, leading us to Prime Minister Menachem Begin. So is it any different today? This Yom Kippur, 40 years later, does Israel have any reason to fear? As always, Israel seeks to keep a qualitative advantage over its enemies. And as of today, we wonder, is it there? Look at what's going on in Syria today. However you feel pro or against intervention by America, just look at the facts. This is the second time that Syria has used poison gas against its own population. And that's when they're targeting Arabs and Muslims. Do you think they would hesitate against Israelis unless a strong deterrence was in place? Look at what's happening in Egypt today. They're now down to a low-intensity civil breakdown. The Sinai Peninsula is in utter chaos. It's currently occupied by Islamist terrorists who have already launched attacks against Israel across the border. The UN, which in the aftermath of the Camp David Accords was supposed to maintain peace and demilitarized zones in the Sinai, has utterly failed. Lebanon, freed now from its decades of occupation by Syria, is now controlled by Hezbollah. There's an Iranian client state along Israel's northern border, and it's armed to the teeth with rockets. The UN, charged with keeping the peace and preventing Hezbollah from rearming after the 2006 war, again, has utterly failed in its responsibilities. Iran, do I even have to mention? Currently pursuing nuclear weapons, and the Iranian government has made no secret of its intentions towards Israel. And the most hostile states towards Israel along its borders are all supported by and are clients of Iran. It's not the least bit paranoid to be concerned for Israel's security today. Now, there are those who argue that the U.S. shouldn't support Israel to the extent that we do. We've heard the arguments. What disturbs me is I hear the arguments from Jews that somehow we're acting counter to our own interests as Americans. It would be better for us to curry favor with the Arab states. They're more important to us geopolitically. Or perhaps we're only supplying arms to satisfy the Jewish lobby in Washington, D.C. And besides, the weapons we supply are being used against the Palestinians, aren't they? I think it overlooks the reality of the situation. Step back and think for a moment. Does anyone see a better friend to the United States in that region than Israel? Is there any other country there with which we share military intelligence gathering, where technology is passed back and forth and developed between these countries, where our economies are so well intertwined and trade is at such a high level? Our interests ally perfectly with a strong and secure Israel. Who else among those nations, I ask you, would we have so close to us? Who else in that region do you think we could trust? The idea that we supply Israel only in response to satisfy a Jewish lobby is laughable and factually wrong. The Camp David peace accords that established peace between Egypt and Israel established those supplies. We supply Egypt and we supply Israel. The idea was to prevent instability by having strong militaries in both places. Yes, we supply a lot of weapons to Israel, about $3 billion worth a year. We also supply about $1.5 billion to Egypt, a country without any external enemies. $4.5 billion a year to maintain peace along what was a bloody and unstable border sounds like a bargain and perhaps the cheapest military operation we run. The idea that Israel's foreign aid is somehow used to subjugate the Palestinians is also pretty far from the truth. Most of Israel's activity in the West Bank is to arrest wanted terrorists, which its military achieves with small arms. That's not what we supply to Israel. Israel has built up its own Iron Dome with its own technology to avoid the need for counterstrikes against civilian populations. That's not using American military goods. And this attitude also ignores the intense military buildup and the Iranian-supplied arms flowing into Gaza. How come nobody ever says anything about that? Is Israel supposed to leave its civilian population to the tender mercies of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza? Would you want to live along that border without a strong defense? Imagine you lived in Sderot or Beersheba or Ashdod. Wouldn't you be demanding defense from rocket attacks? There are many enduring lessons from the war in 1973. First and foremost, Israel can never depend on anyone else for its own defense. 40 years later, Israel's defense industry is now world-class and more than capable of producing its own weapons. Its missile defense technology, its avionics, the unmanned aerial vehicles, so-called drones, are among the best in the world. And according to recent reports, Israel is the 6th biggest arms exporter in the world. The United States is number 1, by the way. I don't think it's anything to be ashamed of. Israel's looked at the alternatives already. They've been tried and they've failed. With or without U.S. support, Israel will maintain a world-class military because it needs one. Whatever support Israel receives from the U.S. is welcome and appreciated, but we shouldn't think for a minute that it will ever be the cornerstone of Israeli defense strategy. We shouldn't be shy about speaking up for the American interest in keeping Israel strong. As Golda Meir once remarked, Israelis aren't going anywhere because we have nowhere to go. People bring up the image of David and Goliath. Remember the old days when it was the Israeli David against the Arab Goliath? Haven't the roles shifted now? Isn't Israel the Goliath? Well, for those of you who know the story of Goliath, what happens to him? He gets killed. I want Israel to be a Goliath with a better helmet. All the same, we can't pretend that Israel is perfect. I would be the first to admit her faults, and I have and will offer criticisms of policies that I find wrong or counterproductive. As a Jewish community today in America, we have widely varied political opinions, and that's a sign of our strength and our maturity. No one can speak for us all on our domestic issues of the day. Israel is not an ideal society. It still has many areas to grow. It still needs to work harder to integrate minorities into its democratic institutions. It still needs to work harder to allow for religious pluralism to grow and take root. It still needs to work harder relieving the increasing poverty plaguing Israel's society. But hey, look at the neighborhood they're in. Given everything, Israel looks pretty darn good. Warts and all, we should rejoice that it's there. Imagine a situation where it was overrun by its enemies. Israel can never lose a single war, because that would be it. And the close call of 40 years ago reminds us of that. The Jewish tradition is not one of pacifism. Yes, we pray for peace 3 times a day, but we aren't naive. Since the days of King David, we've recognized the need for a standing army to defend ourselves. We recognize the need for self-defense. The Talmud taught us long ago, if someone comes to kill you, get up in the morning to kill him first. Don't wait for the blow to strike. Maimonides takes it even further in his legal code and tells us it's a mitzvah, a commandment on all people of Israel who can go out and come to the aid of their fellow Jews caught in a siege to save them from the hand of invaders. We have a mutual defense pact. Joseph Caro goes even further in his code, the Shulchan Aruch. He tells us that the obligation to self-defense is such that when the enemy comes forth, even if we can't see their weapons yet, we can assume their evil intentions. The Jewish tradition is far from pacifistic. But at the same time, we don't seek war. Aggressive wars are forbidden. Our role as American Jews must be a full-throated support for Israel's need for and right to a strong, and most importantly, a deterrent national defense. It's not a question of supporting every Israeli government policy. I don't, and I doubt that you do. But it is a matter of recognizing hard facts. Israel has few friends. And when the chips are down, it knows it must be ready to stand alone. And the only way it can do that is with its own strength. We, of all people, should not be reticent to recognize this. I wish the world was kinder, and that Israel had neighbors with better intentions. But wishes don't make for reality. A Yiddish proverb tells us, A Toit Mensch hat Shiva, 7 Tage. A Narr, sein ganzer Leben. A dead man is mourned for 7 days, a fool his whole lifetime. We can't afford to be fools, or even reluctant when it comes to speaking up. Israel needs every friend it has, including you and me. Gamar Chatima Tova.